She was the last person to hold his hand. Abraham Lincoln, President, Emancipator, the face on every American penny, died in Washington on the night of April 14, 1865. His wife was beside him. She held on until there was nothing left to hold. She survived him by 17 years. And in all that time, the only thing that finally broke her was her son. This is the story no one tells about Mary Todd Lincoln. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. There is a question that historians have argued over for more than a century. It is not a question about war or policy or the great turning points of American history. It is smaller than that, and more uncomfortable. It is this: what do we do with the grief of a woman we cannot understand? In 1875, a jury of 12 men in Chicago was asked to decide whether a 66-year-old widow was insane. The deliberation lasted 10 minutes. The verdict was unanimous. And the woman in question, the woman who was then led from the courtroom, had once been the most recognized female face in the United States of America. She had lived in the White House. She had shaken the hands of generals. She had sat at dinners where the fate of a nation was quietly decided over wine. She had also, on the evening of April 14, 1865, been holding the hand of her husband, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, when a single shot rang out in a theater box in Washington, D.C. She was the last person who touched him while he was still alive. She outlived him by 17 years, and in all that time, the country that had once placed her on its grandest stage watched as she slowly disappeared. First from the headlines, then from polite society, and finally, in a courtroom on a Tuesday morning in May, from her own freedom. What happened in those 17 years is a story almost no one tells. Tonight, we tell it. Her name was Mary Todd Lincoln, and the man who sent those officers to her hotel room door, the man who hired the lawyers, arranged the trial, and signed the papers that committed her to an asylum, was her son, her only surviving son. She was not meant to be a quiet woman. Those who knew Mary Todd in her girlhood in Lexington, Kentucky, remembered her as someone who could not contain herself. Vivid, sharp-tongued, full of opinions at a time when women of her class were expected to have none. A childhood friend recalled that she had a personality that lit up a room, but that she now and then could not restrain a witty, sarcastic speech that cut deeper than she intended. A young lawyer who met her in Springfield in 1840 summed her up in 5 words: the very creature of excitement. She was also, from a very young age, acquainted with loss. Her mother died when Mary was 6 years old. Her father remarried. She grew up in a large and prosperous household that was not, she would later say, entirely hers. She called her childhood desolate. This was not a word she used carelessly. She emerged from her education, French, literature, politics, the things considered ornamental in a woman of her era, with a mind sharper than most men she would ever encounter, and a hunger for something she could not yet name. When she moved to Springfield, Illinois in 1839 to live with her married sister Elizabeth Edwards, she entered a world of rising political ambition. Men who would shape the American century came through those parlors. Among them was a lanky, awkward lawyer named Abraham Lincoln, ungainly in company, devastating in argument, with a face that people noticed and then could not quite describe. Mary Todd chose him, not the other way around. The match alarmed her family. He was too poor, too rough, too uncertain a bet. But Mary Todd had a quality that would define her entire life. She saw things before others did. She believed in Abraham Lincoln's future before he fully believed in it himself. She backed that vision with her full intelligence and her full will. They married on November 4th, 1842, in the parlor of her sister Elizabeth's house in Springfield, Illinois. A small ceremony, no great celebration, simply a room and two people and a promise. The early years were not easy. Abraham Lincoln was often away on the legal circuit. Mary raised their son Robert largely alone. Then came a second child, Edward, called Eddie, born in 1846. He died in February 1850 at 3 years and 10 months old. Mary was 31 when she buried her second son. She grieved with an intensity that the people around her found difficult to witness. She did not soften. She did not perform the quiet dignity her era demanded of women in loss. She felt everything, loudly, without apology. To some, this seemed like instability. To others, to the historians who would eventually revisit her with more patience than her own century allowed, it looked like the only honest response to a world that kept taking things from her. 10 years later, in February 1862, she stood at a bedroom window in the White House while her 11-year-old son Willie died of typhoid fever. She did not attend his funeral. Abraham Lincoln hired a nurse because he could not manage both the war and his wife's collapse. The green room, where Willie's body had been laid out, she never entered again. The room where he died, she sealed. She moved through the White House as if certain places were still burning, years after the fire had gone cold. By the time the Civil War ended in the spring of 1865, 3 years had passed since Willie's death. Mary Lincoln had spent those years nursing wounded soldiers in Washington hospitals, raising funds for freed slaves flooding into the city, and standing beside her husband through 4 of the hardest years any American presidency had ever faced. She had done all of this while carrying a grief that no one around her particularly wished to acknowledge. The country was exhausted. It wanted the war to be over. It wanted to be done with suffering. And on the evening of April 14th, 1865, with the war finally ending, Abraham and Mary Lincoln went to the theater. The evening began as something rare, a moment of genuine happiness. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox 5 days earlier. Abraham Lincoln was in a mood that those closest to him described as lighter than they had seen in years. That afternoon, he had taken Mary for a carriage ride through Washington, just the two of them, and she had remarked that he seemed almost startlingly cheerful. He said he intended to be. That evening, at Ford's Theater, Mary sat beside him in the presidential box. At some point during the performance, she took his hand. According to accounts from those present that evening, they were sitting close together. Closer than propriety might have demanded of a presidential couple, and when she leaned near him and asked quietly what their guests might think of them, he is reported to have smiled and said he didn't care what anyone thought. At 10:15, a man named John Wilkes Booth stepped into the box from behind. Abraham Lincoln died at 7:22 the following morning, in a house across the street from the theater, in a bed too short for his long frame. Mary had been beside him through the night. She would not leave. She was in the room when he stopped breathing. Her dressmaker and closest companion, Elizabeth Keckley, was one of the few people permitted near her in the days that followed. In her memoir, Behind the Scenes, published in 1868, Keckley described what she witnessed in those first hours. The wails of a broken heart, the unearthly shrieks, the terrible convulsions. It is language that was considered, when it was published, shockingly undignified. Too raw, too honest, too too much. Too much. That phrase would follow Mary Lincoln for 17 more years. She did not attend her husband's funeral. President Andrew Johnson permitted her to remain in the White House, and she stayed for nearly 6 weeks, moving through rooms she could not yet bring herself to abandon. In late May, she finally left. In a letter to Senator Charles Sumner, written just before her departure, she wrote, "I go hence, broken-hearted, with every hope almost in life, crushed." She was 46 years old. She moved to Chicago with her younger son, Tad, 12 years old, and the closest thing to comfort that remained to her. Robert, her eldest, her only other surviving child, was 21, beginning a law career, building a life of his own. Congress refused her a widow's pension for 3 years before finally relenting. The widow of Abraham Lincoln petitioned 3 times before receiving what was due to her. These were not her only humiliations, but they were the first. The summer of 1867 found Mary Lincoln in a small room above a shop on Broadway in New York City, traveling under a false name. She called herself Mrs. Clarke. She had brought with her a collection of the most celebrated dresses in American political life, gowns designed by Elizabeth Keckley and worn at White House state dinners and receptions, garments that had been praised and photographed and envied during the years of Lincoln's presidency. She intended to sell them quietly. She needed the money. Debts had been building since before her husband's death, and the pension Congress had finally approved was not sufficient. The sale was meant to be discreet. It was not discreet. The salesman she had engaged guessed her identity and told the newspapers. Within days, the story was everywhere. The widow of Abraham Lincoln, the greatest president the Republic had produced, was haunting the second-hand shops of New York under an assumed name, trying to auction her old dresses for cash. The papers had a great deal of fun with it. The public had more. Mary retreated to Chicago. She left Elizabeth Keckley behind in New York to manage the wreckage, a decision that effectively ended the friendship. Keckley, struggling with her own debts and hoping to explain the situation to a public she felt had misjudged them both, published Behind the Scenes the following year. It included private letters Mary had written to her. Mary was devastated, then furious. She had written to Keckley only months earlier. "I consider you my best living friend." She never communicated with her again. 2 friends gone in the space of a year. One to a book, one to humiliation. The story of Mary Lincoln's widowhood was becoming, steadily, the story of a woman who kept losing the things she reached for. Tad died in 1871. He was 18, the youngest, the one she had been closest to after Willie. He had returned from a European trip with Mary just weeks before he fell ill. He was gone faster than any of them had prepared for. Mary was 52 years old. 3 of her 4 sons were dead. Robert watched all of this from Chicago, from his law practice, from the life he was building. He consulted doctors about his mother's mental state. He observed. According to records examined by biographers, including Jean H. Baker and Jason Emerson, he had been worried about her for years. Worried in the specific way of a man who is also embarrassed, who needs the problem to be managed before it becomes a scandal. He recorded her behavior. He gathered testimony. In April 1875, he hired men from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to follow her whenever she left the hotel. The agents reported back. She was purchasing items with apparent compulsion. Lace curtains for windows she did not own. Multiple watches to add to collections she already had. The hotel manager reported she was describing voices speaking to her through the walls. She had walked into Robert's rooms one night in her nightdress, convinced he was dying, and refused to leave until he physically calmed her. Robert had made a decision. On the morning of May 19, 1875, several men appeared in the hallway outside Mary Lincoln's hotel suite at the Grand Pacific Hotel in Chicago. She did not know they were coming. She had not been told about the trial. She had not been given time to consult a lawyer of her own choosing, to arrange any defense, or to prepare. One of the men was Leonard Swett, a lawyer, a former friend of Abraham Lincoln's, hired by Robert to manage the proceedings. He informed her she was needed in court. Inside the Cook County Courthouse, a lawyer named Isaac Arnold rose to represent her. He had also been a friend of Abraham Lincoln. He had been retained, according to multiple historical accounts of the proceedings, by Robert. He did not cross-examine a single witness brought forward against his client. He did not call Mary Lincoln to testify on her own behalf. He called no witnesses at all. The prosecution put forward physicians, hotel staff, shopkeepers. Robert testified. He told the jury he had no doubt his mother was insane, and that she had been of unsound mind since the death of his father. The jury of 12 men retired. They returned in 10 minutes. Mary Todd Lincoln was declared insane. Robert was appointed conservator of her estate. The following morning, he accompanied her to Bellevue Place Sanitarium in Batavia, Illinois, a private institution, well appointed, run by a physician named Richard J. Patterson. Her mail was read before it was sent. She was not free to leave. From inside Bellevue, she wrote letters in secret, folded small, passed through visitors, carried out by hands she trusted. One reached Myra Bradwell, one of the first women admitted to the Illinois bar, who traveled to Bellevue to see Mary for herself. Dr. Patterson refused to allow the visit. Bradwell told a Chicago journalist, "Mary Lincoln is no more insane than I am." Mary wrote her own account in the letters that survived. "It does not appear that God is good," she wrote to Bradwell in August 1875, "to have placed me here." In another letter, with the careful precision of a woman demonstrating her own sanity, "I am perfectly sane. I do not desire to become insane." She was released on September 10, 1875, 3 months and 22 days after she had arrived. The following year, a second jury declared her, in the official language of the court, restored to reason and capable to manage and control her estate. Now here is the turn. Robert Todd Lincoln was 31 years old when he had his mother committed. He had consulted with 6 physicians before taking action. He had tried less drastic measures first. He had agonized, by multiple accounts, for months. In a letter written to a friend of Mary's on June 1, 1875, while she was still inside Bellevue, he explained himself in terms that deserve to be heard. 6 physicians in council informed me that by longer delay I was making myself morally responsible for some very probable tragedy which might occur at any moment. He believed he was saving her life. Whether he was right is a question that cannot be cleanly answered. Whether any woman in 1875 could have received a fair hearing before a jury of 12 men, whether the standards applied to her were the standards of medicine or the standards of embarrassment, whether a son's genuine concern can coexist with a son's genuine shame, none of these questions have tidy resolutions. What is certain is that Mary Lincoln believed her son had betrayed her. She left the asylum. She did not forgive. And she refused, for years afterward, to acknowledge that he existed. She refused to write his name. In the letters Mary Lincoln sent from Europe in the years following her release, her surviving son appeared only as initials, R.T.L., or as a pronoun she could not bring herself to make specific. Sometimes she called him that one. In her most bitter moments, she called him a demon. And in the phrase that has followed both of them through history, she called him the monster of mankind. She went to France, to Pau in the southwest, a quiet, genteel city favored by British tourists and American exiles who preferred not to be found. She was 57, in poor health, increasingly blind from cataracts, and, by her own description, more at peace than she had been in years. She wrote to friends, "I am allowed tranquility here, and am not harassed by a demon." She would not communicate with Robert. The estrangement was so complete that by 1877, 2 years after her release, Robert confessed in a private letter to a correspondent that he did not know where his mother was living. He knew only that she was somewhere in Europe, and that she has, for unfortunate reasons, ceased to communicate with me. That sentence, the careful language of a man who cannot say what he means. A son who has lost his mother not to death, but to a wound of his own making, and who is not yet, perhaps has not yet, perhaps will never, fully understood the dimensions of what he did. Mary spent 4 years in Pau. She suffered from the cataracts, from spinal pain severe enough to prevent her sometimes from dressing herself. She was a woman in her late 50s who had outlived a husband, 3 children, an asylum, a very public humiliation, and the friendship of every person she had trusted. She was also, and this matters, still herself. Still writing letters, still arguing, still alive. She returned to America in 1880 and went directly to Springfield, to her sister Elizabeth's house, the house with the parlor where she had been married, where she had begun. She had come, without quite saying so, to die somewhere familiar. Robert heard she was back. He wrote to her. In May 1881, 5 years after the estrangement had become complete, they met. The reconciliation was quiet and witnessed by very few. What was said between them is not recorded in any detail. Only that it happened. Only that afterwards something between them had changed. Some long-held tension, some years of anger, had at last run out of breath. Mary Lincoln was 62 years old. She had 1 year left. In the summer of 1882, the people of Springfield came to the house on the corner. They stood in the front parlor, the same room where, 40 years earlier, a woman in a wedding dress had stood beside a tall lawyer and made a promise. The furniture was older. The light came through the same windows. In the center of the room, Mary Ann Todd Lincoln lay in state, 63 years old, died on July 16th, the last Lincoln widow. Robert came. He would not speak publicly about his mother's life in any lasting way, not about the asylum, not about the estrangement, not about the 10 minutes a jury had spent deciding whether she was a person capable of managing her own affairs. He was a man who had learned silence from his father, and he used it for the rest of his long life. He died in 1926, 82 years old, having served as Secretary of War, as Minister to Great Britain, as President of a great American company. He built a beautiful summer home in Vermont. He had grandchildren. He had a career that men envied. He kept the letters. The 25 letters that Mary had written during the insanity episode. From inside Bellevue, from exile in France, from the years when she refused to write his name, had been passed to his lawyer, and assumed by historians for decades to have been destroyed. The Lincoln family had a long practice of managing its own history by eliminating the evidence of its difficulties. But in 2005, a historian named Jason Emerson was searching through papers in an attic when he found a steamer trunk. Inside, folded and yellowed but legible, were the letters. They had been there for 40 years. Robert had not destroyed them. We cannot know why. We can only note the fact that a man who spent his entire adult life avoiding the subject of his mother had kept, in someone else's attic, in a trunk that was never meant to be opened, the record of what had passed between them. Every letter she had written from the asylum, every letter from the exile, every letter that said monster and demon and I am not insane. He kept them. Perhaps he could not destroy the last evidence of her voice. Perhaps, in the dark of that attic, those letters were the closest thing he had left to the woman who had once watched his father die and refused to leave the room. Perhaps he understood something about what he had done that he was never able to say aloud. Mary Lincoln is buried in Springfield, in the Lincoln tomb, beside her husband and 3 of her sons. Her name is carved in stone beside his. Outside the tomb, visitors touch the bronze cast of Lincoln's nose for luck. They are touching the man on the penny, the man carved into a mountain, the man who freed a nation. They do not always stop to think about the woman who loved him. She held his hand until there was nothing left to hold. She carried that for 17 years. The letters waited 40 more.